Please welcome Senior Pastor of Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, Reverend Eric Manning.
Good evening. With so much negative rhetoric, division, and hateful and hurtful speech, let us pause for a moment and let us grab our neighbor by the hand. In my tradition as pastor, I usually ask people to gently squeeze your neighbor's hand. Don't squeeze too hard, but just quickly, 1, 2, 3, squeeze. Again, if somebody squeezed your hand too hard, don't blame me. Blame the person who you are sitting next to. Again, just keep holding that person's hand for a moment. Don't let go. I know the temptation was to let that hand go, but I need you to just endure with me for a few moments. Are we all holding somebody by the hand? Very well. Let us pray. Father, we come into your presence on this day thanking you for bringing us all together from distances near and from far. We praise you, God, for keeping us and how you have allowed for us to travel and to arrive here safely. We thank you, Father, for this time that you have given unto us, a time which is truly remarkable. You've allowed us to be part of the world that you created, and you have reminded us that we are never alone because you have given us all neighbors. Our neighbors may not look like us, may not think like us, may not act like us, but we are all a part of your humanity. And as we are gently touching the person that we are sitting next to, we may not know what they're going through. We may not know their struggles, but we are praying for their families. We're praying for their health. We're praying for their life that you have given unto them. As we are here today, come among us and remind us that there is more that unites us than divides us. Help us to draw strength and inspiration from each other. Help us to be united. Help us to celebrate each other as you have instructed us to do. Help us never to forget that we are indeed together, and that there is more that unites us than divides us. We humbly ask that you would forgive us for the times that we may have used past hurts that have caused our neighbors trouble. We ask now that you would draw us closer to each other and allow for this event to be the catalyst of change that we are desperately seeking in this country. Let your spirit join us in the spirit of civility as we reject anti-Semitism, all forms of bigotry, demoralizing rhetoric, threats of violence, threats that take each other's lives. Be in the presence on this day, and let this event be one that truly, truly sets us all on the same trajectory, a trajectory that reminds us that we are indeed together, and that there is more that unites us than divides us. For your glory and for your honor, nothing more, nothing less. Amen. You may now let go of that person's hand.
Please welcome Rabbi Jeffrey Myers of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh.
let's pretend I'm at the Lincoln Memorial. It is indeed quite intimidating to be present in the structure dedicated to one of our greatest American presidents, Abraham Lincoln, and have the chutzpah, the temerity, to present a speech as not only is one of the great American speakers enshrined here, but so too did Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. offer a glorious speech here. These two great Americans humble me and give me pause to what I might offer that could in some meager way be construed as meaningful and not forgettable. I chose to turn to these two great sources for inspiration. On November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln offered this concluding paragraph in his Gettysburg Address, version 4.0. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. We just observed Memorial Day 1 week ago. The United States of America continues to be a laboratory experiment in a unique form of government. Are all of us present able to affirm that those who gave their lives so that we might live in freedom would be immensely proud of what we have accomplished? Is there indeed equality for all? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King offered these important words at the steps of the memorial on August 28, 1963. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. I too have a dream that groups founded because their constituents are mistreated will no longer be necessary. I dream that one day Black Lives Matter will fade into the past because we don't need them. I dream that one day Me Too will fade into the past because we don't need them. I dream that the Anti-Defamation League will fade into the past because we don't need them. So many other important groups will also see that happen. If we simply resign ourselves to a fate that we don't want yet to seem impotent to change, then we become part of the problem, not the solution. I took a pledge on November 9th, 2018, not even 2 weeks after the massacre of 11 Jews in my building, Tree of Life, that the word hate is a 4-letter obscenity that must be discontinued from our discourse. It is a severe emotionally laden word that can and does lead to violent acts. I have chosen to not focus on the greens at the top of the weed, for if you pull them, the weed will sprout new greens. One must carefully excise the root, being certain to get rid of all of it. The H word is at the root of much that is wrong with our country, and the path to repair begins with one easy step: just don't use it. We must restore civil discourse to our nation. This is not a suggestion. It is an imperative. We must overwhelm those who spew forth H with more powerful four-letter words: hope, love, care. Elie Wiesel, in his role as chair of the United States Holocaust Commission, offered the following keen observations in his speech on September 27, 1979, which I paraphrase. Third, we must remember for our own sake, for the sake of our own humanity. Indifference to the victims would result inevitably in indifference to ourselves, an indifference that would ultimately no longer be sin, but a terrifying curse with its own punishment. Let us not be indifferent. Let us all make a difference. Thank you, and to my Islamic friends, Ramadan Mubarak.
Please welcome AJC National Policy Chair Alan Rich.
Good evening. I am Alan Rich from Illinois. To open this historic AJC event, I have the honor to read a segment of President Lincoln's second inaugural address. This will help to contextualize our presence here on this very special occasion, and to remind us of Lincoln's commitment to the unity of our nation and to the oneness of the American people. A commitment we share here today. Let us never forget his poignant words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." I begin. Fellow countrymen, on the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish and the war come. 1/8 of the whole population were slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of our country. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we not be judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thank you.
Please welcome Director of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum, Dr. Kurt Graham.
Well, good evening. What a thrill to be back at the Global Forum. It's just like I pictured it would be. If America's foremost intellectual, Ralph Waldo Emerson, was correct when he said there is no history, only biography, then the story of civil rights consciousness in the United States grows out of the collective biography of Abraham Lincoln, Harry Truman, and Martin Luther King. It is a uniquely American narrative, born of humanity, of personal courage, and above all, of leadership. And I delight to be able to share it with an AJC audience, an audience that instinctively recognizes the indispensable role of these qualities in the preservation of human dignity and freedom at all times, in all places, and for all peoples. Harry Truman strode onto the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in June of 1947 to address the annual conference of the NAACP. As he stepped up to the podium, he had Abraham Lincoln over his shoulder and the 18-year-old Martin Luther King, figuratively, albeit squarely, in his sights. I should like to talk to you briefly about civil rights and human freedom, he began. It is my deep conviction that we have reached a turning point in the long history of our country's efforts to guarantee freedom and equality to all our citizens. Recent events in the United States and abroad have made us realize that it is more important today than ever before to ensure that all Americans enjoy these rights. When I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. If you are looking for the opening statement of the modern civil rights movement, it was delivered 72 years ago at a gathering not unlike this, on the steps that are behind me. But even more important than what was said was when it was said and by whom. 1947 was not exactly the golden age of equality and acceptance in American civilization. To find oneself outside of what polite and white society deemed acceptable and desirable was uncomfortable at its best and dangerous and dehumanizing at its worst. Just 16 months earlier, an African-American Army sergeant named Isaac Woodard received his honorable discharge from the service. On his way back home from the war to reunite with his family, he was dragged from a bus by South Carolina police and beaten so severely that he permanently lost his sight. At the time of the attack, Woodard was still in his uniform. When South Carolina refused to hold these officers responsible, Truman instructed the Justice Department to investigate. The investigation yielded indictments and a trial in federal court. An all-white jury, however, acquitted the officers, and the courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause as the not guilty verdict was read. In the month following that verdict, Truman established his Civil Rights Commission. But the blinding of Isaac Woodard was still very much on his mind when he spoke to the NAACP. Many of our people suffered the indignity of insult, the narrowing fear of intimidation, and, I regret to say, the threat of physical injury and mob violence. Prejudice and intolerance in which these evils are rooted still exist. The conscience of our nation and the legal machinery which enforces it have not yet secured to each citizen full freedom from fear. The context of his time might have given Truman cover, but instead, it gave him a sense of urgency. Moreover, had Truman been looking for a way to dodge a confrontation with civil rights abuses, he had more than prevalent cultural biases on which to draw. His own family context would suggest that Truman was less than likely to develop into a true champion of civil rights. The day before his address, Truman wrote to his sister back in Missouri, "I've got to make a speech to the Society for the Advancement of Colored People. Mama won't like what I say because I wind up by quoting old Abe. But I believe what I say, and I'm hopeful that we may implement it." Mama Truman would not have liked it at all. She was a Southerner's Southerner, the daughter of a slaveholding family who never lost her contempt for the damned Yankees who would have it otherwise. She asked Truman not to wear his blue Union uniform in her home when he returned from World War I. She preferred to see a man in gray. When he was president, she refused to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom when she visited him in the White House. Where her Confederate heritage was concerned, she was undeterred, unbowed, and unrepentant. For his part, Truman transcended the prevailing perspective of his family and his nation. Though he had grown up in a place and a time that nurtured prejudice, Truman rose above it. Truman overcame. Years after he left office, he reflected on the attitudes he had experienced growing up in Missouri, where, he said, a large number of people were sympathizers with the South. Until you get out in the world and you only have the ideas circulated around the place where you grew up, it was only when I was in the Army and went to Europe that I saw a fairer picture of the blacks in the U.S. As president, I did my best to change their status and help reduce discrimination. Sometimes, when I think about this subject, I regret that I didn't do more. Regret notwithstanding, Truman used his address to the NAACP and other high-profile speeches during his first term to lay the groundwork for a fairer playing field, a field leveled largely by an increased federal presence and role. We cannot any longer await the growth of a will to action in the slowest state or the most backward community. We must make the federal government a friendly, vigilant defender of the rights and equalities of all Americans. And again, I mean all Americans. We can no longer afford the luxury of a leisurely attack upon prejudice and discrimination. Truman was anything but leisurely in his pursuit of justice. He spoke directly, boldly, and specifically. Every man should have the right to a decent home, the right to an education, the right to adequate medical care, the right to a worthwhile job, the right to an equal share in the making of the public decisions through the ballot, and the right to a fair trial in a fair court. Truman was the first president to use the term civil rights. But in coining the phrase, he gave it more than a definition. Through his actions, he gave it life. It is the improbability of Truman's civil rights legacy that makes it so remarkable. Not only could he have claimed and perpetuated the bias of his regional heritage, but there were also far more pressing issues on his administration's post-war agenda. Facing housing and food shortages, labor strikes, and the associated anxieties related to transitioning the wartime economy to peacetime production, Truman was far from compelled by political and economic forces to advance the cause of an oppressed people. The political pressure we associate with the civil rights movement was not yet in place. There were no marches, no protests, no sit-ins. No one had yet dreamed the dream of justice. But Harry Truman recognized the nightmare of injustice. In the absence of political pressure, Truman acted anyway. For Truman, civil rights was not a political question, it was a moral question. When I was president, he later recalled, many people advised me not to raise the whole question of civil rights. They said it would make things worse. But you can't cure a moral problem by ignoring it. It is no service to the country to turn away from the hard problems, to ignore injustice and human suffering. It is simply not the American way of doing things. Truman's effort to confront injustice and suffering head-on drew the ire of the political establishment in the run-up to his re-election campaign. As might have been predicted in 1948, his stance on behalf of oppressed peoples fractured his administration and rent his party. And you all remember that he recognized the newborn state of Israel in May of 1948, desegregated the armed forces and the federal workforce in July of that year. Risky positions going into an election. When the racist wing of the Democratic Party broke away, it nominated South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond as its standard bearer. When asked why he was bolting now, given that Roosevelt made similar promises on civil rights, Thurmond responded, "But Truman really means it." And he did mean it. And I believe he meant it when he said he regretted that he hadn't done more. I believe it because Truman personified the imperative found in Deuteronomy, "Justice, justice you shall pursue." In a passage that might have served as a first draft of Martin Luther King's famous speech, delivered also from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Truman stated, "As Americans, we believe that every man should be free to live his life as he wishes. He should be limited only by his responsibility to his fellow countrymen. If this freedom is to be more than a dream, each man must be guaranteed equality of opportunity. The only limit to an American's achievement should be his ability, his industry, and his character. Our immediate task is to remove the last remnants of the barriers which stand between millions of our citizens and their birthright. There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, of religion, or race, or color." A maxim found in the Pirkei Avot describes the life, legacy, and leadership of Harry Truman as well as anything I have ever read. In a place where there is no humanity, strive to be human. In his striving to be human, at a time when our nation was awash in a sea of inhumanity, Truman stood at the feet of the great emancipator to let the world know that the work of freedom was not yet finished, nor will it be finished until everyone is free to be human. We live in a time marked largely by the absence of leadership, but we need to remember that the March for Freedom is more than a freedom march, more than a march on Washington. It is a march toward the ultimate potential, the self-actualization and full realization of the family of man. Humanity and courage are the twin pillars of leadership. One cannot lead without genuine concern and genuine conviction. Leaders like Harry Truman absorb the anxieties of those around them. They dispel fear by instilling confidence. They inspire because they are inspiring. They place the well-being of others ahead of their own self-interest. Thus, to a leader, justice is never a burden. It is a motivator. My friends, we have seen great leadership before, and we will see it again. We will see it when we demand the humanity and courage of those who would be our leaders to echo the words and the attitude and the resolve of Harry Truman. We will be well led again when we require our representatives to reach beyond their base voters and base instincts, to connect with what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, to make Martin Luther King's dream something more than a dream. As Harry Truman concluded his remarks in 1947, he offered an observation that is as relevant for us, if not more so, than it was for his immediate audience. The way ahead is not easy. We shall need all the wisdom, imagination, and courage we can muster. We must and shall guarantee the civil rights of all our citizens. Never before has the need been so urgent for skillful and vigorous action to bring us closer to our ideal. The ideal of which Truman spoke remains intact. The self-evident truths on which our republic was founded have not changed. But the slender thread of freedom that found its way from the framers to Lincoln, from Lincoln to Truman, from Truman to King, and from King to this very hour, begs a question of each of us. As we pick up that thread, what will we weave into the next scenes of our civic tapestry? As we contemplate our shared inheritance, especially as it relates to our core principles of freedom, equality, and justice, we will do well to draw upon the example and legacy of Harry Truman in working to make the opportunity to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity fully available to all Americans. And when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. Thank you so much, and God bless.
Please welcome Chief Executive Officer of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change and daughter of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Bernice A. King.
Good evening. I am honored to join with each of you in the AJC community of conscience as we reflect upon the legacy of President Abraham Lincoln, President Harry Truman, and now Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. No one who is here today can deny the fact that we are living in very polarizing times, where hateful and violent rhetoric and action are a constant reality. Yet as we, the community of conscience, gather together in the city that my father delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech from the steps of that Lincoln Memorial almost 56 years ago, I have been tasked to recall some of the words he spoke on that day to those fighting for freedom and justice amidst a climate of hatred and evil. He said, in the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. Some 4 years later, in 1967, my father delivered another message entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" during his last SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference convention. In that message, he said the following: I'm concerned about a better world. I'm concerned about justice. I'm concerned about brotherhood. I'm concerned about truth. And when the one is concerned about that, he can never advocate violence. For through violence you may murder a murderer, but you can't murder murder. Through violence you may murder a liar, but you can't establish truth. Through violence you may murder a hater, but you can't murder hate through violence. Darkness cannot put out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. He continued, and I say to you, I have decided to stick with love, for I know that love is ultimately the only answer to mankind's problems. And I'm going to talk about it everywhere I go. I know it isn't popular to talk about it in some circles today. And I'm not talking about emotional bosh when I talk about love. I'm talking about a strong, demanding love. For I've seen too much hate on the face of too many Klansmen and too many white citizens counselors in the South to want to hate myself. Because every time I see it, I know it does something to their faces and their personalities. And I say to myself that hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to love. And the beautiful thing is we aren't moving wrong when we do it, because John was right. God is love. He who hates does not know God, but he who loves has the key that unlocks the door to the meaning of ultimate reality. Although these words were spoken some 56 and 52 years ago, they still resonate today. My father's legacy is that of love. As leader of the modern civil rights movement, he showed us that love is not passive. It does act in the face of violence, hate, and brutality. It acts with courage to stand up with truth and the ability to take hits, but with a refusal to inflict harm. It was love that gave him and those who followed him the strength to resist falling prey to hatred and bitterness and rage toward the evildoer. He often reminded people that love compels you to not only refuse to hit or hurt your opponent, but to refuse to hate your opponent as well. My father made love a conscious choice every day, no matter what he was faced with. Instead of choosing to respond from his emotional instincts, he chose to respond from his higher self. That is why he could say, we must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. May we all be reminded that love is still the only answer as we seek to create a more just, equitable, humane, and peaceful world today. We need leaders who, like my father, will let love fuel their work. We need leaders who choose love as the pathway, even when others say and do all manner of evil. In the days ahead, if we're going to change the climate of our times, then it is incumbent upon us to arm ourselves with this weapon of love, which is the only power that can expose and drive out evil, bitterness, bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hate. When we show up in any environment, especially where there's hatred and anti-Semitism and bigotry and violence and bitterness, we should be prepared to show up with love, where the tenor and tone of our words are that of truth, kindness, and compassion. We must recognize, as my father did, that love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Love is the only beacon capable of disarming the hearts and creating the opportunity for truthful dialogue. Through the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, We educate and train people in the precepts and strategies of nonviolence used by my father, of which unconditional love is at the core. There are two very important tenets that are critical in any struggle to combat hate and violence. In the first place, it is always critical to direct all aggression toward the evil and injustice, and not the person doing the evil or injustice. You direct love and conciliation toward the person. We say that nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice and evil, and not the people doing the injustice or evil. It attacks forces of evil and not the people doing the evil. The reason for this is because, in the second place, the goal is to win the adversary, the evildoer, or the hateful person over, and not to win over them. In this vein, we teach that nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. If we focus negative energy toward the person, then all we get is more negative energy, and nothing changes. We just end up with more negative, more hate, and more violence. As my mom used to say, though, somebody has to cut off the chain of violence. Nonviolence and love are the only way to do this and bring about a true transformation. Nonviolence, as espoused by my father, can help to bring about both external legislative and the internal heart change. Dr. King taught us that the power of coalitions to bring about these kinds of changes are powerful. We can change our current climate of hate and violence if we work as a coalition of conscience, to commit to work in a synergistic fashion to change both the internal and the external. Through religion and education, we work to change the internal attitudes. Through the legislative process, we work on policy and laws to curtail the external effects of those bad internal attitudes. In the final analysis, if hate, violence, bigotry, bitterness, anti-Semitism are to be defeated in our world, we must open up channels of constructive communication and move in the direction of dignified dialogue, where we talk with each other rather than damnifying dialogue where we talk at each other. In 1962, my father spoke at Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa, and he said, "I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other." In closing, I charge this community of conscience to move forward in the days ahead, to engage in these dignified dialogues, leading with love. This is our hope, and this is our faith for the future. And in the words of my father, again 56 years ago, from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he said, "With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation and world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood, and I add sisterhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, 'My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to become a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of that old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Please welcome our community of conscience partners.
At this time of rancor and division, and in this place of healing and remembrance, AJC joins hands with fellow Americans, representing the varied fibers of the tapestry of this great land, summoning them to stand with us, draw strength and inspiration from each other, and together with us, convene the community of conscience.
Join us in the spirit of the American motto, E pluribus unum, as we unite across difference, celebrate our diversity, contribute to a shared society, and resolve to advance the welfare of all.
Join us in the spirit of patriotism as we strive proudly and boldly to uphold American ideals of equality, of dignity, of opportunity for all.
Join us in the spirit of civility as we reject anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry, incendiary partisanship, whatever its sources, dehumanizing and demonizing rhetoric, and threats of violence.
Join us in the spirit of democracy as we reaffirm and reinforce our constitutional system, seek equal justice for all, and safeguard our fundamental freedoms.
Join us in the spirit of American pluralism as we promote mutual respect, not mere tolerance, as the standard, enlightenment, its coexistence.
Join us in the spirit of inclusiveness as we reach out to uplift the poorest among us, as we welcome the stranger in our midst, and as we fully enfranchise the differently abled.
Join us in the spirit of love as we counter those who purvey intolerance and incivility, especially those who legitimize their inappropriate practices based on Holy Writ.
Join us in seeking to fulfill the biblical teaching that we are all B'Tselem Elohim, all created in the divine image, the very foundation of human equality.
Join us in pursuing the prophet Isaiah's age-old vision that one day nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore, that peace, love, and unity will reign.
For those who believe, as we do, that our liberty and aspirations depend on the noble principles articulated by President Lincoln and defended by generations of brave Americans since the founding of this republic, our call could not be more urgent. We invite all who share our concern for the future of this great country, our appreciation of its fundamental strengths, our conviction that it must overcome its challenges, and our resolve to honor the American spirit, to join us in the community of conscience.
Please welcome AJC Chief Executive Officer David Harris.
There's not much left to be said. This is a moment we began thinking about a year ago. We felt it was time to mobilize words into action, something that AJC has tried to do for 113 years. But we also understood that these were defining moments in history. And ultimately, those defining moments in history would define us, and not just history. And how would the American Jewish Committee be viewed looking back upon these years? And so we conceptualized the concept of a community of conscience. And we dreamed for good weather, which shows you that we Jews still have some work to be done. And we dreamed about getting together with our partners of many faiths and races and backgrounds and creeds and stand together on the single most iconic real estate in our country, the Lincoln Memorial. We came close. But ultimately, this evening will be remembered, I hope, less for the venue and more for what this means. The problem we have, if I can summarize it, is we know the words. Indeed, we could reduce all of the speeches and all of the manifestos to one simple sentence which has been with us in our respective religions for literally thousands of years. And that, of course, is the Golden Rule. Each of the religions represented here has embraced the Golden Rule. The problem is not in finding the words. The problem is in actualizing those words. For me, as a Jew, I've been profoundly moved and motivated and inspired my entire life by several basic Judaic concepts which again may not be unique to the Jewish people, but have universal application. When I first learned the story of Adam and Eve as a child, it was a curious story to me. I missed its fundamental meaning until later. And then the learned rabbi explained, if there were only two people at the start of the human journey, who among us can claim a better or different lineage? Hard to argue. And as if that weren't enough to create the words we need, again, the Jewish religion introduced the concept of B'Tselem Elohim, that we are all created in the image of God. All. Not all Jews or some Jews. All. All of us. Which, by the way, explains why in the Jewish religion there is no image of God. How could there be? These two concepts are so simple, devastatingly simple. We all descend from Adam and Eve, whether we believe it as theology or mythology. It still makes for a compelling story. And we're all created in the image of God. Therefore, anything that desecrates any human being desecrates God, however we interpret the notion of the divine. What's been our problem? Why thousands of years later do we need to gather to affirm a new community of conscience? When on our stage, we had to mourn with the Reverend Manning of Charleston, who lost 9 of his parishioners in his church in Charleston, South Carolina, because of an act of hateful violence that was based on nothing more than racial animosity. Why do we have to mourn with Rabbi Myers of Pittsburgh, who is here because 11 of his congregants on a Shabbat, for the simple act of praying and seeking to become closer to God and to one another, paid with their lives? And why do we have to be together with Dr. Bernice King, whose father gave his life in 1968, a day I will never forget as a teenager, because once again, hateful violence transcended brotherly love. And on it goes. We've understood at AJC that we can't go it alone. We mustn't. None of us can. We must all stand together. We must all stand together because of the inspiration and the strength and the support it gives to each of us, and also because we know realistically that we are in for a battle of our lives against those who would divide us, those who would assert their triumphalism, those who would claim their 1-800 line to their divine, those who believe that we should have a taxonomy based on race, religion, creed, identity, sexual preference, whatever the categorization may be. Don't underestimate their strength. Here and around the world, we're in the battle of our lives to define who prevails. We've made enormous progress over the years. We shouldn't ignore or underestimate that. But nor should we ever for a moment rest in a spirit of complacency or indifference or apathy or sense of victory, because those forces are there and they wish to do us all harm. And maybe one day it's the African American worshipers in Charleston, but we know, don't we, that those who would kill those worshipers would also just as happily kill Jewish worshipers or Muslim worshipers. We know it, don't we? Because the act of murder is an act of assault on our concept of a democratic and pluralistic society based not on tolerance. If nothing else this evening, as we proclaim the community of conscience, may we delete and discard the word tolerance. Our standard in life should not be to be tolerated. I do not want to be tolerated as a Jew, nor do I want to tolerate others. I seek respect. I offer respect. I seek understanding. I offer understanding. And ultimately, in the prophetic vision, Dr. King, yes, like you and your late father, we seek love. For the moment, I'll accept respect and work toward understanding. But like the prophetic vision, we're not giving up. Because the ultimate prophetic vision, when you strip it all away, is a world at peace and a world in harmony. And it's nothing less that we are here on earth to pursue. Lastly, for AJC, the community of conscience is another step in that direction. We've taken previous steps, and we hope in some small way that we've modeled what we believe to be appropriate civic behavior. The Gaze Hill Baptist Church in Millen, Georgia, was a target of a racist arson attack some years ago. We were horrified at the notion that a house of worship could be targeted because in this case, the worshipers were African American. We are not Baptists. We are not African American, but in those days we became both, we believed, at least in a symbolic sense. And we went to Millen, Georgia on several occasions, and our AJC Atlanta office went more frequently. And with our hands, we helped to rebuild that church. There are times to pray with your heart. There are times to pray with your head. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said in the Civil Rights Movement, there are times to pray with your feet. And I would argue there are times to pray with your hands, and not just by clasping them in prayer. It means rolling up our sleeves and saying the Gaze Hill Baptist Church in Millen, Georgia is our church every bit as much. And an attack on that church is an attack on everything that we fundamentally believe in as an organization since 1906. And when the St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church was destroyed on 9/11, among the very first acts of AJC in response to that horrific day was to reach out to our Greek Orthodox friends and say, a part of our soul was destroyed in the destruction of that church. We are with you and will stand with you until that church is rebuilt. We may never worship there, but nonetheless, a part of our head, heart, and soul are in that St. Nicholas Greek Orthodox Church. And let me leave you, if I may, with one other example of praying with our hands, which I hope can also serve as an inspiration as this community of conscience goes forward and grapples with other instances of hate based on collective association and responsibility. Some years ago, as some of you will remember, there was a leader in Serbia, then Yugoslavia, called Slobodan Milosevic. He engaged in a policy of ethnic cleansing to remove the Muslims of Kosovo. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Kosovo were expelled from their homeland simply because of the hateful ideology of Slobodan Milosevic. We were horrified. But we decided that in moments like that, the American ritualistic thoughts and prayers are insufficient. Thoughts and prayers cannot repair a situation. They're an easy way, forgive me, to check a box of emotional empathy and then move on, while the victims haven't moved on. And so we decided when Bruce Raymer was president that we would travel to the neighboring countries surrounding Kosovo. And in one in particular, the country today that is called North Macedonia, we met with Muslim refugees in the camps, and in particular a camp run by the German military to try and provide support to these refugees. We were so moved by what we saw and by the compassion of the German military that when we left, we asked ourselves, should we check the box on, let's call it condolence tourism? Been there, done that, now we feel more virtuous about ourselves and let's move on. And then we decided no, that was the beginning of the journey, not the end. And instead, however improbably it may sound, we flew to Germany. And we went to our friends in the German government, including the German military, and said, we have just seen the essence of humanity. And we have an idea. What if the German military in uniform and the American Jewish Committee 50 years after the Holocaust join hands together to provide material support to Muslim refugees of Slobodan Milosevic's making? And the German government embraced the idea. And within weeks, German Air Force military planes were carrying medicine, tents, blankets, and other needed supplies for these Muslim refugees. And our message was twofold. We knew we couldn't entirely undo the damage that had been done by Milosevic and his partners in disrupting those hundreds of thousands of lives. But our message, and it's a message I hope that resonates tonight as we launch the community of conscience, if 50 years after the Holocaust, Germans in uniform representing a new and democratic Germany and the American Jewish Committee, in this case, whose director's parents were both survivors of German final solution policy, could join hands to extend assistance to people that neither of us knew, who had been targeted solely because of their religious and national identity. If we could do that, anything is possible. As we move forward with our community of conscience, let that be our guiding principle from tonight forward. Anything is possible if we learn to pray not only with our heads and our hearts, but with our feet, and yes, our rolled up sleeves and our hands. Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight.
Please welcome AJC Board of Governors member and Senior Rabbi of Central Synagogue, Angelo Buckdahl, to lead us in the singing of America the Beautiful, which can be found on your program.
Please remain standing and join me with Sisterhood and Brotherhood of Harmony. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesty above the fruited plain. America, America, God from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the years. Thine alabaster cities gleam, undimmed by human tears. America, America, God shed His grace on thee, and crown thy good with sisterhood, from sea to shining sea, and crown thy good with sister and brotherhood, from sea to shining sea. Let freedom sing. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This concludes this evening's event.
This land is your land, and this land is my land, from the California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.